Hi all. We're starting the Poverty Now seminar of the LBJ School, and we're very pleased to be here today with Dr. Chad Stone, who is the Chief Economist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and who's going to talk to us about what's going on with unemployment and how the pandemic has affected employment and the unemployed population. Chad is, like both Jamie and me, a former staff director of the Joint Economic Committee. So, there's a little cabal of us here. He's also been working on unemployment-related issues for many years and has a great deal of expertise on this. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where Chad is the chief economist, does a lot of work with the Congress, and Chad is one of the folks that people turn to get a sense of where things are going in terms of unemployment and unemployment legislation. I expect that Jamie will be here shortly, and in the meantime, Chad, if you'd like to start.
Okay. Thank you. Let me start out by saying, can you see my slides?
No, but we can see you.
Oh, I guess you have to turn on technology. There we go.
Here you go.
So I should say, anybody who watched John Oliver on Sunday had already got a primer on unemployment insurance, which I'm going to focus a lot of my attention on because it's one of the most important programs that addressed what happened in the pandemic. But he did a great job. He had, it turns out, consulted with some of the experts in the field that I'm on calls with all the time, trying to work through unemployment insurance issues. And of course, he does it with more humor than I will. But thanks to Pat and Jamie for inviting me and for the opportunity to be part of the Poverty Now series. Good afternoon to everybody, at least everybody in the eastern half of the United States for whom it's afternoon. I'm going to talk about the unemployment in the context of the unemployment insurance provisions that were done in the pandemic relief programs, and unemployment insurance as part of a long-term problem that needs to be addressed. That we had good short-term solutions in the pandemic, but we need further reform. And I'll also talk about how these programs have matched the character of unemployment in the recession. So three things I want you to take away about unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance, it's a social insurance program. It's not a means-tested program. It's a joint federal-state program that has been seriously broken since before the Great Recession. And so when you have a period of rising unemployment, instead of unemployment insurance kicking in smoothly the way it should to try to relieve the burden and fight the financial distress that unemployed workers and their families experience, it doesn't do a very good job of that. So it's a broken system. The good news in my talk is that the emergency measures that have been taken in the pandemic crisis were a robust response to the three main problems with the system, which is restrictive eligibility criteria, inadequate weekly benefit levels, and insufficient weeks of coverage to help workers and their families through an extended period of high overall joblessness in a recession and its aftermath. And the third point, which follows from the first two, is that these measures were robust, but the antiquated UI system had difficulty delivering them at times, and they're temporary. While they provide a model for fundamental UI reform, and the pandemic really put the unemployment patterns in the pandemic really put the unemployment insurance system to a test, those measures don't represent fundamental reform. And that's why we have had 3 actual potential cliffs in which policymakers had to enact new legislation to keep those provisions going. So fundamental reform remains an ideal, and we should do it before the next recession. So, oh boy. Oh, I have to go to
You need to move on your slides here.
on the slide. Yes, indeed. Which I haven't. There's that window. Okay, there we go. So UI and an overview. And this is about the system not being broken going into the pandemic, and the places where the jobs were lost were places that the old system just couldn't handle. So UI social insurance program enacted along with Social Security in the Social Security Act of 1935, not means tested. It's you qualify by losing your job no matter what your income is. Size of your benefit depends on what your earnings were. It's a federal-state partnership with considerable state autonomy, subject to a few federal guidelines and requirements. And one of the aspects of brokenness was that the states were all over the place in how prepared they were to deliver robust unemployment insurance benefits. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, unemployment insurance pays weekly benefits to workers who lose their job through no fault of their own, and it's meant to tide them over, they and their families over, through a period of temporary joblessness, to prevent them from falling out of the labor force and potentially into poverty even. But many of you in the audience may be new entrants to the labor force. You're probably not people who've quit or were fired for cause, but those disqualify you from receiving unemployment insurance. You have to have a work history to get unemployment insurance. Benefits are financed by state tax collected from employers, subject to minimum federal requirements on the amount of earnings subject to tax. And there's a small federal tax that provides revenue for administrative costs. In good times, tax receipts get put away in a trust fund. They get run down in recessions. If states exhaust their trust funds, they can borrow from the federal government to continue to meet their obligations to provide benefit with delayed repayment and interest obligations. So, subject to some federal guidelines, states have considerable autonomy. So UI was originally designed to address unemployment spell of a male breadwinner on temporary layoff who expected to go back to work at his, I emphasize, old job when economic conditions improved, not for the modern labor market. Not for the modern labor market in which there are people who don't fit that category. Lots of people who don't fit that category. In the modern labor market, there are people who work in lower paying jobs, move around among jobs, have family caregiving responsibilities, especially working single moms, who want or need to work part-time, maybe at multiple jobs, but don't have the right kind of earning history to meet state criteria for receiving benefits, and for whom weekly benefits may be so low as to not be worth going through the hassle of applying. Or you may have trouble figuring out how to apply and how to. The governor of Florida, famously in the unemployment insurance world, the current governor of Florida said, "Man, I look at this system and it's like it was designed to keep people from being able to apply." And it turns out that his predecessor, the current senator from Florida, was governor at the time, is the one who put all those barriers in place. So people who get excluded from unemployment insurance, who don't fit the model that the system is still designed to serve, are unemployed workers looking for part-time work. You're supposed to be working for full-time work. People who leave work for compelling family reasons, like caring for an ill family member, very important source of being jobless in the pandemic. People with uneven earnings history. You may have just moved into a new job, even though you've been attached to the labor force, but you spent a little bit of time searching, and so you don't have recent quarters of work, or ironically, which I won't go into, you may have 2 recent quarters of work that the period that they look at was designed for a time when everything was done on paper. And so your most recent earnings history, which may be your best earnings history, don't necessarily count for receiving unemployment insurance benefits. Contract workers not treated as employees. So Uber is very careful to make sure, even though they may be doing so illegally, that Uber drivers are not Uber employees. And so Uber is not paying into the unemployment insurance system. And so contract workers generally don't qualify for unemployment insurance. And then we get to the folks who've lost the most jobs in the, or rather, these categories correspond to people who've lost the most jobs in the pandemic. Low paid, especially women and people of color. And the nature of the nature of the recession and the nature of the recovery has meant that those people are out of work. Many of them are working in essential jobs, but perhaps becoming sick in those in those essential jobs. It's not safe to go back to work in face-to-face jobs. Those are the kinds of jobs these people tend to hold, and the unemployment insurance system was not designed to handle any of those people. Should also add that coming out of the Great Recession, when states had to borrow from the federal government to pay UI benefits after exhausting their underfunded trust funds and not wanting to raise taxes on employers, they cut benefits, reduced eligibility and the duration of benefits, so as to reduce what their payments would be in the next recession. So in the competition between states being the laboratories of democracy and states being engaged in a race to the bottom, in too many states, the race to the bottom won out. Laboratories of democracy is an ideal rather than a reality in unemployment insurance. So just before the pandemic, the share of unemployed workers receiving UI ranged from a high of 57% in Massachusetts to lows of 11% in Arizona, Florida, and Louisiana, 10% in Nebraska, North Carolina, and South Dakota, and 9% in Mississippi. Now, as I said earlier, some people don't qualify for unemployment insurance because they're new entrants and so forth. But those restrictions that I talked about produced a system that was totally unequipped to deal with what was going on in the pandemic, where there are a lot of health-related reasons and job closing reasons related to the pandemic that put people out of work. And a lot of those people may not have had the earnings history necessary to get UI, but they certainly lost their job through no fault of their own. So some response was needed. Typically, the federal government comes in with some extra weeks of unemployment after a person exhausts their regular state unemployment in a recession. But this recession was really, really sharp and happened very quickly before what's already in state law kicked in. But amazingly, moving to the second part of my three things to learn. As I was saying, sorry, a little behind on my slides. It was a system badly in need of reform for the reasons that I went through. States had cut benefit levels, restricted eligibility, in some cases cut the maximum number of weeks of benefits, so that a very small number of people were eligible. Then came the pandemic, the COVID recession, very short and sharp in terms of the formal definition of a recession. The economy lost huge number of jobs in in March and April. And jobs started to come back starting in May and June, in part because of the stimulus, especially the pandemic unemployment benefits that were in the CARES Act passed at the end of March. So there were three major pieces of this, and they addressed all of the problems in the system. Let me step back a second. So the March-April contraction in economic activity and the rise in unemployment reflected the nature of the pandemic, as I said, and social distancing, and it was heavily in public-facing service sector jobs. Leisure and hospitality. So where the workforce was overrepresented by people of color, women, people with no more than a high school degree. Low-wage earners workers in industries that paid low wages. You don't stigmatize the workers for being low wage. You stigmatize the employers for paying low wages. So people paid low wages, and not necessarily eligible for unemployment insurance as in the system heading into the pandemic. But in March, Congress passed the CARES Act, which I describe as a flawed miracle. It wasn't perfect, but it's astounding what bipartisan Congress did in unemployment insurance. Now, what makes it imperfect was it wasn't tied to economic conditions, and so we ran into situations where there was a benefit cutoff cliff several times, but to go through the programs and why they were important. Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, PEUC, addressed the problem that in a recession, unemployment spells last longer, and state benefits, a much higher proportion of people will exhaust their regular state benefits. And as I said earlier, the Congress policymakers have stepped in almost every recession since the late 1970s, often too late often somewhat late to provide additional weeks of benefits. That's a fairly common thing. In the Great Recession, it was called EUC, Emergency Unemployment Compensation. Now it's called Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. But you have to be in the regular unemployment insurance track. You have to have received. You have to have been approved for and received regular state unemployment insurance benefits and exhausted them before getting those extra fully federally financed benefits. Second important thing, talked about that state benefit levels vary a lot. So the federal pandemic unemployment compensation, the famous $600 a week, was put in to provide a benefit boost to carry through to support workers who were likely to be experiencing longer spells of unemployment and therefore would run through their savings if they had them very, very quickly. And the normal unemployment insurance system is meant to replace about half of your lost earnings, and in many states it doesn't even do that. So this was really a crisis for unemployed workers. And what the $600 boost, I should say, this is the second time we've done a boost to benefits. In the Great Recession, we boosted benefits too. by $25 for 1 year. So $25 a week for 1 year. So this $600 became notorious, of course, but it only ran until the end of July 2020. And as we're moving up to the expiration, we were hoping that policymakers would do an extension, but they didn't. And as a result, from August through December, there was no supplemental benefit, except for a brief period when President Trump found a way to temporarily use FEMA money to provide a few weeks of $300 benefits, but it was very short-lived. But then in December, at the very end of the year, when all these programs were scheduled to run out, I guess let me mention pandemic unemployment assistance before talking about the programs running out. So I talked about how there are many people who don't qualify for regular state unemployment insurance benefits for a variety of reasons. And recognizing that problem, Congress and the President enacted a separate track of unemployment assistance benefits from the regular state track called pandemic unemployment assistance. This gets described. So this addressed the problem of eligibility for UI benefits going into the pandemic being too restrictive and not suited to the kinds of jobs that were being lost, to the people the kinds of jobs people were losing. And so PUA really important for it gets characterized as being for gig workers, which it was contract workers and gig workers could qualify, but sometimes and people who had to take care of a sick relative or lost their job because their business had to close due to the pandemic. So you didn't need the same kind of earnings history necessarily as you did in the regular system because you lost your job through no fault of your own, the pandemic, and that qualified you for PUA. Now, it was really difficult to get the program up and running. The state computer systems were completely overwhelmed, and it didn't happen quickly in some cases. And so sometimes you had to wait and you got multiple weeks of benefits. And you weren't required, the states weren't required to package the $600 a week benefit together with your regular state benefit. In PUA, there was a minimum benefit that was half the average regular state benefit. So Massachusetts, where the average state benefit was $550, the PUA benefit, even if you only qualified for the minimum. If you had earnings history that was better than that, you could get a higher PUA benefit. In Mississippi, where the average benefit was $215 going into the pandemic, PUA provided you a whopping $107 a week. That's why the $600 a week was so incredibly important, and losing it after July was really hard on PUA recipients, and it was hard on the recovery. So the benefits that got provided through the unemployment insurance system and the other things in the CARES Act, the economic impact payments, the so-called stimulus checks, and some other things, provided an incredible amount of income to people who, without them, would have been really strapped. So they were allowed, many of them, if they were receiving these unemployment insurance benefits, were able to meet their bills, pay their bills, buy their groceries, even pay the rent in many cases. People not in unemployment insurance, people who weren't getting these benefits with low incomes, they faced eviction, but there was an eviction moratorium. But But if you weren't in the unemployment insurance system and you had a low income, you didn't have anywhere near the amount of support that the UI system provided. That's why I'm saying it was kind of a miracle, but you had to be in the unemployment insurance system. But the PUA program brought in a lot of people who wouldn't have been in the unemployment insurance system. And so there were some complaints in some quarters, which I'm sure you're aware of, that people were getting paid more than 100% replacement rate, that with the boost to benefits and with the regular benefit they were receiving, they were earning more than they had earned by if in their job that they left. And this gets argued as a disincentive to go back to work. Well, at the time that the $600 was in effect, there weren't any jobs to go back to work to, for the most part, and so it was a false claim. You still hear it, and it's an issue in debates about unemployment insurance. But sorry, I'm checking my. Oh, I'm going way longer than I should. I'm going way longer than I should. So let me just say that with fits and starts and several benefit cliffs, we've arrived in the current act with that President Biden is likely to sign tomorrow. We will have $300 a week insurance benefit, $300 a week boost to weekly benefits, PUA continued, additional weeks continued, so that nobody exhausts unemployment insurance before September 6th. That's an awkward date, but I won't go into it. The success. It's not because it has to keep being renewed, and it's not really structured as a program that would phase out automatically when conditions improved. It's not, you can't just turn it into permanent reform, but it showed many of the things that permanent reform needs. So I just want to go through just a couple more slides to sort of show you the dramatic nature of the rise in unemployment and in unemployment insurance claims in the pandemic. So this is a chart where the bars represent the weekly initial claims for unemployment insurance, and the lines represent ongoing claims for unemployment insurance. So, and the red line is claims in the regular program. The green line is claims in pandemic unemployment assistance PUA, and in the additional weeks in the regular program, the PEUC. And you can see that that over time, that those CARES Act programs being renewed were really critically important and were a substantial share of the unemployment insurance benefits, the continuing claims for benefits. And part of the reason for the decline in the state benefits is the transition into those federal benefits, those temporary CARES Act programs, once you exhaust your 26 weeks of regular benefits. Pre-pandemic, the December to early March, 200,000 a week was the common amount of initial claims. 2 million a week was the number of continuing claims, and those were fairly steady. And those were low numbers, even historically, because the economy was relatively strong. But since then, we've had 50 straight weeks in which combined PUA and regular benefit initial claims have been more than 1 million, likely to be the same every week. Tomorrow, when we get the latest report, it'll probably still be true. And of course, you can see that the total claims in all programs was over 30 million. Some question about whether there might be some overstatement there, but I'm not going to go into that. Emphasize again that the people who lost work were disproportionately people paid low wages, women, workers of color. And these additional unemployment insurance measures were critical when they were in effect and as long as they're in effect at maintaining those groups' ability, those individuals' ability to sustain their families so much better than they could with no unemployment insurance. And many of them would have had no unemployment insurance without the PUA program. And my last slide was just I'll go through it real quick. Basically what it looks at is Massachusetts, Mississippi, and the median state, and you can see the broad diversity of base benefit levels. So in January and February, when there was only the regular program, $550 average weekly benefit in Massachusetts, $215 in Mississippi, $366 in the median state, $386 nationwide. From February to July, these numbers all jumped up, so that even in Mississippi, you got $707 a week. However, with the expiration of the $600 bump and nothing replacing it from August to December, things were awful for unemployed workers for the average unemployed worker in Mississippi, and other states with low benefits. The package about to be signed has a $300 boost, and that will raise, even in Mississippi, the average weekly benefit to 407. So sorry for running over, but whoops, I'm going to come back. But I look forward to your questions, and
thanks. Thank you very much, Chad. That was really interesting. Folks who are watching, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and please feel free to do so. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask a couple questions. Can you give me a sense? I mean, you said something that seemed to me pretty shocking. Before the pandemic, benefits were passed. Something like, you said 10% or so of people who lost a job or didn't have a job were covered by unemployment insurance in many states like Mississippi. Is that right?
In the states, yes, in the states that cut back on their benefits after the Great Recession, when they didn't want to have adequate funding for their unemployment insurance system because that would annoy their employers, even though we economists think that ultimately workers bear the burden of non-take-home pay, things that employers provide. But in any case, yes, that is correct. And in North Carolina and Florida in February, the maximum number of weeks of regular benefits were 12, not 26, which was the
wow.
number. Yeah.
So after the passage of the CARES Act, what proportion of people who became unemployed were covered? I mean, what's the bump up?
Well, if I don't have a chart on that because for the reason I'm about to say, that number is over 100% if you just look at the unemployment insurance claims and you look at the official unemployment rate, but the official unemployment count. But the official unemployment count is an understatement of job losses. And the continued claims for unemployment insurance in a week or a month is an overstatement because it can include some people receiving, the same person receiving multiple claims in the same week. It's not supposed to be back because of backlogs. It's not supposed to be that way, but the states have been reporting it that way. Also, you can collect unemployment insurance if your hours have been cut back in many situations. So you can still be employed, but collecting unemployment insurance. But the fundamental fact is that huge numbers of jobless workers who would not have qualified for unemployment insurance did qualify with
Mhm.
the
And
contact
this
measures.
is particularly true, as you were saying, for folks who were in low-paid jobs to start with. Is that right?
That's right. That's where the job losses were. The job losses were heavily concentrated. We did an analysis at the Center on Budget um, where we looked at where the job losses were by industry and and we divided the industries into pre-pandemic categories pre-pandemic based on the average wage paid in that industry. We divided into three roughly equal sized, and so the bottom third of industries who paid the lowest wages had 31% of workers pre-pandemic. The used American Community Survey data to try to
Uh-huh.
get that in, but they had 57% of the job losses,
Uh-huh.
and it's still disproportionate that way. This
So
long
basically,
period.
low-wage workers are almost twice as likely to have lost their jobs as other people.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
yeah. It's, do we know? There are still lots of people who appeared. I mean, we know that food pantries are seeing more clients as during the recession or during the pandemic, and there are other indications that there's still a fair amount of hardship out there. What's your take on how that relates to what did or didn't happen with unemployment?
Well, in the we at the Center on Budget in past recessions and this one have argued for a suite of policies that include unemployment insurance, which we got, increased SNAP benefits, which we got in a not very good way and not fully adequate way, increased emergency assistance, TANF type stuff, and aid to state and local governments, and got some of those things, but a lot of people, a lot of poor people are not. We're not in the labor force, and we didn't do as much for them as we did for the unemployed. We did great for as I've said many times, the PUA program was really great for workers who wouldn't normally have qualified, but there are a lot of people that were not workers, and of course the families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because one of the noticeable things about unemployment benefits is that, unlike a lot of other programs, they don't take into account how many people you're supporting.
That's
So
right.
if you've got, 6 kids, then $600 isn't going to go as far as it would for a single person. So that perhaps is a contributing factor.
Yep.
We didn't up as much the programs like SNAP, which is the new name for food stamps, as much as we did other things. Is that right?
That's right. That's been remedied in the American Rescue Act. There is a bump to SNAP benefits. There's a lot of money flowing to the states. The unemployment insurance provisions are continued, and there's the child credit bump and expansion of eligibility. The refundable child tax credit. That's something that we've been pushing also at Center for a long time. The fact the child tax credit phases in. So if you have very low income, you get a partial credit or no credit. And for the first time, at least temporarily, in the current act, you get a full child credit without having to work, without having without there being an income threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So very low income folks with kids are getting a nice child tax credit. But none of that happened. None of that happened up until now.
Mm-hmm. And that's a refundable credit. So in other words, even if you don't pay any taxes, you still can benefit from the credit. It's not like a dependent allowance or something like that, where it comes out of the taxes you pay.
Exactly.
That's
It's paid through the tax system, but
Mhm.
and there are issues about outreach to get people to file returns or to use other means to actually claim the credit. So
Mhm.
that's an issue with that was an issue in the CARES Act with the economic impact payments, and still is, that we need folks at the state and local level to be helping with outreach to identify folks who are not required to file income taxes so that they can actually receive these benefits.
Mhm. We had a question from Sarah Murphy from our audience asking, is there any guidance provided to states when implementing a federal program? Is there a penalty if the state does not make an adequate effort to implement a program?
Um, yes, there is guidance, and there is a penalty, but the penalty. There's a penalty if you don't follow the federal. So there are some federal requirements about unemployment insurance system, about unemployment insurance. There are some federal guidelines and federal requirements, and you have to follow the Fair Labor Standards Act. And if you don't, it's a carrot and stick approach. There's a federal tax that's collected from employers, a large amount of which is refunded in any state that follows the Fair Labor Standard Act and doesn't violate any of the provisions. And because it's such a substantial reduction in the tax, all states have carried that out. All states have bought into the things they're required to buy into. The problem is they're not required to buy into enough things. And so unemployment insurance reform would set a floor under maximum weeks of benefits. So it'll be 26 or more, rather than allowing some states to offer as few as 12.
Would it also set a floor on benefits?
I'm sorry?
Would it also set a floor on benefit levels? Because I mean, as you show in the Mississippi to Massachusetts comparison, so there's huge differences across states.
Right. The proposals are usually for a replacement rate, a minimum replacement rate of at least 50%, and probably higher. We learned from the process through which the American Rescue Plan got passed that you can aim big.
And, I was going to pop in here with a question on exactly that. In that area here. And by the way, Chad, it's a pleasure to meet you. I don't know that we've ever met face to face before. But our careers have gone in concentric and intersecting circles for many decades.
A couple of times at AA meetings.
Okay.
Hanging out with Bryce.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah.
And I just was going to ask you about the process for arriving at these numbers, where the $600 came from, how it ended up there rather than 500 or 300 or 400, and again, maybe also you say a word about the political dynamics that got us 1.9 trillion in the Rescue Act that you were just referring to.
Yeah. So the $600, along with what the average rate, what the average state benefit was, brought you to something like the best estimate of a certain replacement rate. There was some ad hoc, casting around for a formula.
And when you say replacement rate, you mean replacement of what your previous earnings were before you became unemployed.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so this was partly based upon the fact that with so many millions of people filing claims, that you were dealing with a pretty relatively high income strata of the population who went compared perhaps to normal turning in the low end of the labor market. Would that be fair?
Well, interestingly, that if I'm hearing you right, in the Great Recession, every high income person knew somebody who'd been laid off.
Mm.
In this one, high income people don't know anybody who's been laid off.
Right. I'm not talking about high income people, but I'm just saying the 600 is if you were just looking at the fact that low income people got laid off, 600 seems like, you know, that was hard to see how you got to the 600 number.
Yeah, because it aimed to be generous. They came up with a rationale that's just a rationale, and because it only went to July, I guess even the Republicans. I mean, even the president. Things were so bad at the time that you had to look like you were doing something, and that's the problem this time. You asked about the political dynamic on this one. The problem this time is that it appeared to people who are relatively well off that everything's getting better. What's the problem? And yet, amazingly, the caucus held together. Now, it's only because of the Georgia election victories that there were the 50 votes, right. And it was because even the folks who, even the blue dog is almost not a term that applies in the Democratic Party anymore, but the Joe Manchins and Kristen Sinemas and some others, they did not want this to fail. They had leverage and they tried to use it and they got a little bit, but they did not want it to fail, I believe. And that was the political dynamic that held things together. And, Chuck Schumer and the various committee chairs held things together. Yeah.
That's an advantage in congressional politics that have only a very narrow majority in some respects. It keeps people focused on the need to hold the caucus.
Yes, that's true. Although unfortunately, we're one elderly senator's death away from not having majority. So that's another issue as to what's going to happen going forward. Before you tuned in, so to speak, Jamie, Chad made the point that in fact, job losers who potentially benefited under this were about twice as likely to be from low income.
Oh, I heard that. Yeah. No.
Yeah. So it is, while it is true that the median benefit might be higher because there were a lot of people who were laid off from all kinds of different jobs, it was still the case that the impact is greater.
No, I was just trying to get a sense of where a particular number comes from. This is part of what the audience is going to be interested in, is how this policy process actually works. But I want to ask you another question looking forward as to how you see the unemployment situation in the labor market developing. There seems to be embedded in even in the rescue package, the thought that the things are going to be in another 6 or 8 months. This will be behind us, and I'm for one quite skeptical of that. And a lot of businesses no longer exist, and there's a fair amount of change in the way labor will be deployed in let's say retail and in commercial office buildings and so forth. It suggests that we're going to have a fairly long-term problem, and I wonder if people are thinking about how to deal with that and what needs to be done.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and on the other side of the central tendency forecasts is the view that you're going to get serious overheating of the economy that's going to cause the Fed to raise interest rates and cause a crash. I will say that it depends on how addressing the COVID measures, and there's a lot of funding to try to get the vaccines done and all that. And to the extent that works, that makes it easier for folks to go back to work. You're right that many of their employers may not be there, but there is a side benefit of the SNAP money, the UI money, and the state fiscal relief is that there's a good bang for the buck program. So there is actually a lot of stimulus built in there. Now, you raised the question of whether there'll be something to stimulate, whether there'll be jobs to go back to, whether there will be more severe supply constraints than.
And also technical change. We have, by inviting you here today, deprived the airlines of some revenue and the hotels of some revenue and even restaurants of revenue because we're doing all this over a medium that doesn't require any of that. And we'll be depriving a lot of people who served commuter populations. So their lunches will not find that there are not so many commuters, no matter what happens in the prosperity of the economy. I wonder if you're confident that there will be enough restructuring to absorb the labor force that was displaced.
Well, the goal, as you know, is another package later on, which is an investment, infrastructure investment, and green investment program that one of the things that it aims for, besides rebuilding infrastructure and fighting global warming, is creating jobs. How well that's designed and how well that works remains to be seen, but there's definitely a commitment to doing it.
Sure. My worry about that, just to not to get too far off course, is that those are construction jobs by and large. They're jobs which are not the same kind of jobs that the service workers, the tens of millions who've been displaced, are likely to be in a position to pick up. So I think there's still a large number of people for whom the future remains very, very uncertain.
I think that's right.
That brings me to another point that you emphasize. We really need to have real reform in the way UI benefits are determined. And these are temporary patches, right? The things that what do you see as, are we actually going to get a reform of the UI system in the wake of all this?
Well, one would hope that the next package includes some steps along the way in UI and maybe in some other things to doing that. I don't see that there's the legislative capacity to do all that real quickly. And there'll be at least one more year, likely, with the Democrats having the trifecta and wanting to do those kinds of things. There's certainly energy in the advocacy communities and in the policy communities, and there have been ideas. In unemployment insurance, the UI community has been advocating for reform and perfecting its thoughts about how that should go for quite a while. Before in 2019, there was a lot of work that we and others were doing on automatic stabilizers to get ready for the next recession, and that included doing a lot of reforms to UI. But future is hard to predict.
Yeah, it is indeed. You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, one of the things we can predict is that our hour is just about up. So, Jamie, do you have any closing questions?
Well, I was going to ask you one other thing. Is that have the computer systems now been fixed? Isn't this quite remarkable in this most advanced of all possible countries that we can't get the basic systems working properly to be able to absorb the?
I don't know the age distribution of who's listening, but
yeah.
Many of you will have to ask your grandfather what COBOL was. It was a programming language, and it's still the one that's used in many of the state unemployment insurance systems. So there are funds going for them to upgrade their system, but that'll take a little bit of time. But yes, there are funds going.
And again, it's one of those things where the Massachusetts-Mississippi divide is pretty real, right? Some states have systems that are much more up to date, and some don't. That's
Just reminds me of the fact that when NASA sends a probe to Jupiter, it's working on software that was designed in the 1970s.
yeah.
I know. A computer
But at least that works. I mean,
right.
Yeah. Well, part of it is that this is a federalized system. I mean, it's a state and federal system where a lot of the initiative is on the state side, and states have no real incentive to invest in this stuff when there isn't a recession. So, it's hard to make things happen.
Lots of advocates for real reform think federalizing the financing as well as the requirements for minimum requirements for benefit levels and so forth. That's a big step. So it looked more like Social Security.
Yeah.
Still a tax on employers probably, but no state taxes, no state trust funds. But as I say, that's the dream of reformers.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have a long way to go. Well, Chad, thank you so much. We greatly enjoyed having you here today.
My pleasure.
And I know you have to go, so we'll say goodbye, but we'll talk again soon.
Okay.
Thanks to the audience, and I wish them a great spring break, and we'll see you again when we come back afterwards. Pat, who do we have on tap for the first week or so after spring break? We shall.
I think we have Derek Hamilton on the 31st, and I am blanking on
wealth differentials, March 31st, with racial wealth differentials with Derek
Racial wealth differentials on March 31st.
Thank you, Tori. Okay. Once again, thanks, Chad. Thanks to the audience. Thanks, Pat. It's
okay.